virtual author event with Robert Giles, author of When Truth Mattered, the Kent State Shootings 50 Years Later. Tonight's program is just one of our many exciting virtual events planned in June. Next week, we have a full lineup of programming, including Paleolithic anthropologist Rebecca Ragg Sykes, who will discuss her new book, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. We'll also host professional musician Tony Apadesano, who will discuss his experience and friendship with music legend Frank Sinatra. More information about all of our programs can be found on our website at hudsonlibrary.org. I want to let everyone know that we will accept audience questions during the second half of our event. If you have a question for Mr. Giles, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Copies of When Truth Mattered are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. We have provided a link in the chat for easy purchase. And now I'm pleased to introduce both tonight's speaker and moderator. And I would just like to say that for the first time in our virtual programs, our speaker and moderator are together in the same location. Bob Giles was editor of the Akron Beacon Journal at the time of the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970, and led the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize winning coverage. He is also the retired curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Bob Giles is joined in conversation with Doug Stanton, a New York Times best-selling author, lecturer, and screenwriter. His books include The Odyssey of Echo Company, In Harm's Way, and Horse Soldiers. Now, please welcome and join me in providing a warm virtual welcome for both Mr. Giles and Stanton. Thank you both so much for your time this evening. Please take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
That's very nice.
It's so nice to be in person with you.
Yes, indeed it is. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about When Truth Mattered. It's still an important topic, even though the 50th anniversary of Kent State is now in the past. But there are many things that matter out of that story and the reporting we did at the Akron Beacon Journal that resonate effectively today.
I know, Bob, that so many people watching and around the world know this story, or they think they know it. But why did you write When Truth Mattered as the former editor of the Akron Beacon Journal? I mean, how is your take different than what is it we don't know about this story?
Well, there were a lot of things that I was able to put in the book and report that had not been clearly illuminated. But this is a story about a newspaper, a medium-sized newspaper in Akron, Ohio, with a circulation of about 170. And it was a paper that was, I think, well trusted by its readership. And they looked to us for truthful reporting on the news of the day. When Kent State, the 50th anniversary of Kent State was approaching, I began to think about the newspaper's role. I had read many of the books, fine books, about Kent State. And one night I was sitting at dinner with Doug Stanton and another friend, John Bacon, and telling them stories about what the newspaper did. And they kept saying, "You have to write this story, you have to write this story." And so I started to think about it seriously, and I went back and looked at all of the wonderful journalists who helped tell that story, and I found that many of them are gone. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to tell their story so that the public will always remember these courageous and valiant journalists who told this important story. And so we were able to use the history of the truth-telling in our newspaper. And the reason that I wanted to, another reason I wanted to write the book was to tell some of the stories that, some of the situations that had arisen in the immediate aftermath of Kent State, that the newspaper was able to change the public impressions and public opinion about, which are important in today's understanding of what happened at Kent State.
Was it painful When we were sitting at dinner, Bob, and I remember the look on your face was like, really, you guys think this could be a book?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but I listened. And these are two successful authors, and when you have them as your audience, you better well listen up.
How did reporting this story affect you? Let's talk about the emotionality of this, because two things: the tick-tock of the newsroom.
Yeah.
It's happening and you're grabbing it, but it also had to be, had to be traumatic for the reporters. Or was that not in your thinking?
There it was, and as I wrote the book, and the book was fairly easy for me to write, because I had such a good memory of what happened. I had thought about it for years. It was deeply implanted in my memory. And in addition, I had access through the internet to the pages of the newspaper from that period. So I could accurately reprint in the book what was reported in the paper. But there came times when I sort of teared up in writing about some of these wonderful people who worked with me, and the things that they did to uphold the values of the newspaper, as well as tell a truthful story about what happened at Kent State.
Take us back to May 3rd, the day before these events in 1970. Who were you?
I was the managing editor of the Beacon Journal. My boss, a man named Ben Mainberg, was executive editor. And he had gone out of the country on a junket to Israel with some local business people. And so he said to me as he was leaving, here's how to get a hold of me while I'm gone, but you're in charge. Don't screw it up. And then he walked away. So I was left in charge. I was 37 years old. I was in my early years as a directing editor of a newspaper, and I had the burden of making sure that the paper got out every day, and that we didn't mess up. But when the Kent State shootings occurred, I knew that the burden of directing our staff really fell to me. Now, on May the 3rd, May the 3rd was one of 2 or 3 days previous. All of the action, the protests and so on about Kent State came as a result of President Nixon's speech on April the 30th. That was Thursday night, in which he said he was sending troops to Cambodia. And the following day, there were protests and demonstrations on college campuses and other places all over the country. On Friday night in downtown Kent, the students were gathering in the bars as they traditionally did. It was the end of the term. It was a sort of celebratory mood, but the town mayor, Leroy Satram, was nervous, and he panicked. And he ordered the police and the sheriff to clean out the bars. And so here you had, on this warm spring night, some kids who were half inebriated pushed out onto the main street of Kent with their beer bottles, and they rioted, and they threw the beer bottles through the windows and did other damaging things. And so the mayor then turned around and called Columbus, the state capital, and asked for the National Guard. And the National Guard was sent. And on Saturday night, May the 2nd, the students organized a rally near an old ROTC building on the Kent State campus. This is a 1947 wooden building, and the students burned it down. And so the next day, The National Guard was on campus, and the governor, Jim Rhodes, came. He was in a tight Senate primary race with Representative Bob Taft on the following Tuesday, so it was a political trip for him. And one of the early things he did was in a meeting with local officials, the prosecuting attorney in Portage County, Ron Kane, said to him, "Governor, we have to close the campus. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of violence and a lot of trouble." The governor refused. He said, if we close the campus, they'll think I'm weak. So then the governor made a speech in which he called the students Nazi brown, worse than the Nazi brown shirts, the worst kind of people that we have here. It was sort of echoing a theme that President Nixon had done several weeks earlier when he called student protesters bums. So on Sunday, May the 3rd, that was the mood. And the governor had said there will be no demonstration allowed on Monday, May the 4th, which was scheduled by the students at noon, because there will be no demonstrations allowed, peaceful or otherwise.
So we kind of skipped. Burning down a building on a campus is a certain kind of reaction.
Sure.
Just for a moment, for those of us watching and listening who weren't there, what was going on? Why were tensions so high in America at that moment? I mean,
Well, the Vietnam War had become very unpopular. The idea that President Nixon would send troops into Cambodia without going to Congress, which he was constitutionally obligated to do, and in the case of Kent State, that the governor would would agree to a request to bring armed National Guard troops onto the campus, violated a deeply held principle that the students believed in, which was, this is our turf, this campus is ours, and we have the freedom to make whatever statement we want in opposition to the war. But all of this, there were elements of opposition and fear of the draft. Many of these young men knew they were going to be drafted and perhaps sent to Vietnam and put in harm's way. They desperately wanted to have the freedom under the First Amendment to speak out against the war. So, and the tensions in the town of Kent were very high because most of the townspeople thought the students were radicals. They were influenced by what they called communist elements. There was an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, which was thought by people in the town to be a radical left-wing group, even though they had nothing to do with the protest that followed on Monday, May the 4th.
And on Monday, the May 4th, shots ring out. You are at home.
I was in the office.
You're in the office,
Yeah.
right? Because it happens in the afternoon. Take us through that day, and then perhaps we can talk about why the reporting has been so important for the world's understanding of this event that you did at the Beacon Journal.
Well, our Kent State coverage was directed by a really old-fashioned newspaper guy named Pat Engelhardt. He was the state editor. And Kent State had a couple of demonstrations in the years prior to 1970. There had been a protest against recruiters from the Oakland, California Police Department. There had been some protests involving the United Black Students and what they wanted in terms of programs for their organization and their students. And we had covered all these very thoroughly. And Pat was was dedicated to becoming an expert on the history and so on. So that throughout the weekend, after President Nixon's speech on Cambodia, we had covered a lot of everything that went on. And then on Monday morning, we didn't anticipate any violence, but we knew there was going to be a rally, and so we had a plan. We had a young reporter on the Kent State campus who was a journalism student who had been a stringer for us at the Beacon Journal for 4 years. His name was Jeff Sallet, and he was an excellent young reporter. And we sent him and 2 photographers out to the campus just to watch the rally. So one of the critical elements of getting the story on that day, as the shooting occurred at 12:30, and Jeff was on the campus, and he was watching the movement of the National Guard troops pushing the students aside and then coming back up to a pagoda, which is next to the journalism school building, where 28 of the guardsmen turned and fired their M1 rifles at the students, killing 4 and wounding 9. And Jeff wisely, before the shootings, had gone into the journalism school building and went into the dean's office and found the secretary, Margaret Brown, and he asked her if he could use her telephone. And she said, yes, of course. So he called Pat Engelhardt back in Akron, said, I've got an open phone line here. And he says, well, make sure you keep it open. And so he said to Mrs. Brown, will you hold this phone line for us? And yes. And so all through the shooting and leading up to the shooting, there was a lot of tear gas fired by the National Guard. And one time when Jeff came back into her office, she was the air conditioning system at Taylor Hall had begun to suck in the tear gas, and she had tears running down her face. She was under her desk, but she was hanging on to that telephone, and that telephone was the only way we could communicate in the instance in the minutes after the shooting, because almost immediately the Ohio Bell telephone system broke down on the campus, and in Kent, because so many people were calling in to see if their students were hurt and okay. And so we had that open phone line, and it enabled us to put out three editions with news of the shooting, including the final edition, which had the names of the dead students and the wounded, and a lot of the details of the shooting.
The paper and your editorial direction did a very important thing early on, which was they began to correct the record that was floating off the campus and from the authorities. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because I know you're justly proud of this.
Well, one of the immediate rumors, it turned out to be a rumor, about claims by the National Guard leadership, sought to shift the blame from the shooting guardsmen to the students, some of whom had thrown stones and rocks at the guardsmen, trying to make the claim that the guardsmen's lives were threatened, and therefore, to protect themselves, they had to shoot. So one of the only piece of evidence that was the case was in a metal sculpture, which was right by Taylor Hall. It was a 15-foot high modern piece of sculpture, was made of Corten steel, and there was a single bullet hole in that sculpture. And the National Guard looked at it, and on one side of the hole was a furred area, and the other side was clean. And they interpreted those two sides as the bullet having come from where the students were. Well, this kind of nagged at us, and we
Meaning
decided.
there was a sniper
Meaning there was a sniper, yes,
among the students. Yeah.
among the students, and so we this nagged at us, and we decided we were going to do our own test. And so Pat found a guy with an M1 rifle and a piece of Corten steel, and went out in the field and did some test firing, and it proved just the opposite. That the furred circle is where the bullet went in, and the smooth side is where the bullet exited, and it showed that the bullet had come from the guard position, not the student position. And so we ran that story in great detail on the following Sunday, and that really put to rest the guard's effort to use that bullet hole to establish that there was a sniper who fired at the guardsman.
I mean, you titled the book "When Truth Mattered." This is one of those moments.
Yes, that's right.
And I thought it was so enterprising when you went out and found the steel and shot through it. We were talking earlier, what if you'd screwed it up? What if you'd gotten the story wrong? I mean, we're now able with hindsight to look back and say, we're quite certain this is what happened. And so therefore, certain political and social things followed from that.
Well, there was, in fact, in the immediate aftermath of the shootings, there was somebody who got it wrong.
Okay.
The United Press International was a major wire service in those days. And they had a reporter on the campus, and he was stationed down by the National Guard headquarters area. He didn't see the shooting, but he overheard a telephone conversation between a National Guardsman and somebody on the scene. And he overheard the guy on the telephone by the guard headquarters saying, "We've got 2 dead here, send an ambulance." And he assumed, and assuming is something a newspaper journalists should never do. You got to check your facts. But he assumed that the 2 dead that he was referring to were guardsmen. And then there was two dead students. And the wire service, UPI, put that out across the nation. And the local newspaper in Kent, the Kent Record Courier, ran a stripped headline in their afternoon edition. 4 dead at Kent State, 2 guardsmen, 2 students. And then radio stations all across the Midwest carried that story. Now, if that angle had held up, it would have proved to a lot of people who believed that the radicals were armed, that they had no good intention, and so on. It would have upheld their story. In our newsroom, we had young Jeff Sallet in the journalism school who witnessed the shooting, and he said, no, there were 4 dead students. So we had to make a quick decision because we were right on press deadline for the first edition that was going to tell that story. And so it was my responsibility. And they turned to me and they said, "What do we do?" And I said, "We go with our guy. He was there. He saw it." And so our story was accurate. But think of, and the newspapers and the radio stations that had carried the erroneous report later had to do second editions with a change and so on to get the record straight. But our reporting established the reality, the truthful reality, that the 4 dead people were all students.
But what made you trust Jeff? And what were you relying on in that moment?
It was a gut instinct.
Yeah?
Yeah, it really was a gut instinct. I didn't hesitate. I mean, I knew that Jeff had been who knew as much about Kent State as anybody in our newsroom from his 4 years of reporting as a student. And he had done wonderful work for us And I just believed that, I believed him. So if I had to make a choice between the UPI and our guy, I went to our guy.
Since the book has been out for a while, this leads us to another interesting point about what you've learned talking about the news reporting, the story we all know so well, but actually the behind-the-scenes mechanism of bringing it to the public's attention. What are people curious about when they hear you talk? What do they want to know? Like I just asked you why you trusted Jeff. The question is, how do you do news?
Well, one of the qualities that becomes part of you when you're doing journalism is your instinct. You learn how to look at facts and situations and so on, and decide whether this is truthful, or this is disinformation, or something else. And that's become part of the media landscape today. So that was something that, over time, if you work for a news organization like the Beacon Journal, which had very high values for accuracy and truthfulness, and it all came from our owner, John S. Knight, who's probably remembered by many people in the Hudson area. He said, the motto of my newspaper and his newspaper company, Knight Newspapers, is get the truth and print it. And we lived by that watchword throughout our career, and that's how we were taught. And it was simply something that we lived by.
What do you say to people, though, in this who say, how do you know the truth, or there is no truth, or what? Talk about that for a moment.
Well, one of the things that happened to me that was a surprise, even though I put this in the book, when I was getting ready to publish the book and doing the marketing, and it was in the middle of the early phases of the pandemic, so that my bookstore talks and other talks were being canceled. But I found a person who would arrange radio interviews for me, and over 3 or 4 months, I had about 50 radio interviews on the book, and all of the radio hosts were very, very appreciative of the book, very serious in their questions, and they wanted to know a couple of things. They wanted to know, what are the parallels between today and 1970? And so I talked to them about some of what I put in the book. And I'll just read some of these to you. The incendiary language, elected officials taking actions designed to play to their conservative base, soldiers and police armed with lethal weapons moving against protesting citizens, trampling First Amendment rights to speak out against the injustice of the war, destruction of property by the students, murder by law enforcement officials commissioned to protect citizens, actions by leaders with a political purpose, firing tear gas grenades at demonstrators, threatening to kill citizens for not obeying the military or police, official covers up, failure of leadership, and trying to intimidate journalists. And so I came up with a list of ways that I can say to people, if you want to find out the truth in how you read your daily newspaper or listening on television or radio, what are some of the things that you can look for that will help you figure out whether this is truthful or not? And there are eight sort of what I call 8 lessons in helping people find truth in today's news reports. And I'm just going to read you the headlines. 1, be wary of rumors, misinformation, and disinformation. 2, Welcome the scrutiny of those who are powerful. 3. Beware of journalists bearing opinions. 4. Give your attention to those journalists who depend on the experts who know the subject best. 5. Objectivity is still a virtue in a reporter. And 6. Beware of false equivalencies. 7. Don't get sucked into conspiracy theories. And 8. Always be skeptical of what you hear and see and read. So those are lessons drawn from the book, but I've condensed them, and I found that those who were interviewing me on the radio were reflecting a struggle that citizens today are having in trying to figure out what is the truth. We're hearing so many points of view and so many different versions of what may be news, may be ideas, and so on. How do you figure that out? And so I believe that if a thoughtful reader can apply, think about each of those 8 points as they look at the news, it'll help them figure out, this is truthful, or this is maybe not truthful.
Bob, you're posing kind of being a citizen as a more work than we might be used to. In other words, we have a job to do.
Yes.
To read and to engage, and I think today, I don't know if you agree, but so much information, quote, comes to people that it's very passive. Our relationship to what's happening becomes very passive, and we accept things.
Well, social media has contributed a lot to that. It's an easy way to have news come to you, and one of the sad consequences of that is that the readership of the daily newspapers has fallen off, and this has been particularly critical in local communities. Local news is so terribly important. Because if citizens in a community allow their newspaper to deteriorate, then the people who hold the responsible offices in the town and in the state are inclined, in some sad cases, of breaking the law, cheating, theft of funds, misappropriation of funds, and so on, not serving their oath of office, which is to protect the public good and serve the citizens who put them there and whose taxes pay the work that they do and the salaries that they get.
I mean, I think people listening right now are 2 things. What can they do to prevent the deterioration of their local newspaper? Write letters to the editor, subscribe, I guess.
Subscribe, buy a newspaper. It's very important to keep the local press alive if you want your community to remain wholesome and healthy and honest in its leadership. The newspaper, more than any other element, can bring truthfulness and stability of that to your community.
So what you write about and When Truth Mattered was a big story. It's perhaps one of the biggest. It's the first big story of the new decade of the 1970s. Is that correct? I mean,
the first big story of the 1970s. Clearly, the leaving Vietnam in 1975 certainly was followed on in that. But right at the cusp of 1970, this was a huge story, and it resonated all over the world.
Could Twitter have reported on this? And I wonder if you've pondered how the reporting might have been different. Might have gotten away from us.
Well, in the last chapter of the book, I asked the question, if Kent State happened tomorrow, Kent State shooting happened tomorrow, what would the coverage look like? And I introduced the idea that the internet would have made a huge difference. That the protesters on the Kent State campus, many of them would have been carrying iPhones or cell phones with cameras, and they would have been taking pictures of the National Guardsmen as they moved up and down the campus, taking pictures of their protesters throwing rocks and stones and so on. And then when the shooting came, they would have recorded, many of them, the shooting itself, or students falling with bullet wounds or fatal wounds. And then the story would have gotten out to the world in a blink. 4 dead at Kent State. That would have been all over the world in just an instant. And then that would have become the basis for beginning to understand what happened. And in the early moments or hours after the shooting, people would have had just the video or the cell phone videos of the pandemonium and so on that occurred when the shooting occurred and then followed. And then you would have had a period in which the commentators would have taken over. And you would have had cable news parsing the film, editing the film in a way that would make a point of view, whether it's MSNBC or Fox News or whomever. And finally, the professional journalists who would still be adhering to their values and to their principles would take the story and begin to shape it into a more truthful version. But whether that would have been too late or not is a good question, because so much public impression comes from the internet, comes from social media. And if they get a hold of a story like this, it's breaking in an instant and is followed by pandemonium and an unclear picture of what really happened and what caused it, you're going to get strongly different public views on understanding of what really happened.
Well, listen, why don't we go to some questions?
Okay.
I know that
Good
people
idea.
are listening may have lived through this or just hearing about this for the first time. And if there are any, we can certainly have you answer them.
Okay, happy to.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the discussion the two of you had. I think that was a really insightful discussion. We do have some questions coming in. The first question I'd like to ask is a little bit how you were talking about how it would have happened if May 4th happened today. GC in the chat would like to know, can you imagine any way that local journalism could be supported through some mechanism of government funding?
Well, that's pretty much against the Constitution, but there are instances, encouraging instances, where citizens with means are forming foundations to run newspapers or are buying local newspapers with the intent of investing in the news gathering and strengthening their ability to cover the community. We have some examples of that, but on a big scale. Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post, has invested millions and millions of dollars in making that a much better newspaper. The Los Angeles Times has profited again from a wealthy owner, but unfortunately these are rare instances. But this is a means by which a good community-minded citizens of means can step up and invest in the local newspaper with the motive not of making a lot of money, but making a profitable and worthwhile and truth-telling local newspaper. That's beginning to be done more and more, but this is a difficult time because in some cases new owners of newspapers like hedge funds have in mind only to make money. Newspapers are profitable. It's a profitable business, and some of the hedge funds maintain their profits by cutting the size of the news staff, cutting the amount of space given to the local news, and so on. And those are sad situations. One of the things I referred to in the last chapter of the book was sort of lamenting that the Beacon Journal could not have covered Kent State in the way it did today compared to 1970. The Beacon Journal in 1970 had a staff of 170. Today it's about 35. And they're gamely trying to put out a good newspaper, and they're serving their community. But it's nothing like it was back in the days of the Vietnam War and the years that followed, when newspapers were very prosperous and did good journalism.
I should mention, for those, just before we go to the next question, that you won a Pulitzer for this coverage.
We did,
the
yes.
The paper was well rewarded nationally.
Yes, we won the Pulitzer Prize for local news coverage. And there were many elements in our entry into the Pulitzer competition that reflected on our truth-telling in the Kent State story. One that we haven't mentioned is our getting a copy of an FBI report that was a summary of the FBI's investigation of the shootings. The FBI had 100 agents on the campus very soon after the shootings, and their purpose was to, according to the Justice Department, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, was to find the culprits among the students, the demonstrators. And what the FBI found and wrote in its summary was that the guardsmen had no reason to shoot the students. There were other ways to control the size of the gathering. Lives were not in danger, and so on. And we got a copy of that report. It was obtained by a reporter in Portage County. He got it from the county prosecutor, Ron Kane. And we ran that story, this was in July of 1970. It was a huge story across the country because here was a government agency, the FBI, criticizing another government agency, the Howe National Guard, in a death situation, life and death situation. And we got a lot of criticism. The letters to the editor column just filled up. Many of people being very, very critical of the newspaper for publishing a leak. Nixon called it a leak, and he wanted to kill the story, but of course the story was out, so there was no way of shutting it down, and that was one of the major elements in the exhibition or the exhibit that we put together for in our application for consideration for a Pulitzer.
Next question.
Okay, so this one is looking at the legacy of May 4th. Susan would like to know, do you think keeping the day in the public eye is helping remembering, or is it helping at all?
Could you repeat that, please?
Susan wants to know about the importance of remembering May 4th. So how Kent State continues to have their annual programming.
Well,
Do you think it's
it's
important?
I think it's very important. I think remembering. I mean, Kent State is such a powerful moment. It's when the war came home to America, and it was a moment in which, as people said to me when I was doing reporting on this book, they were killing our children. It was an awful moment, a tragedy in our history. We can't avoid our history. We have to study it and learn from it. And so the commemoration that takes place every May 4th is vital to that process. You know, in the years immediately after May 4th, Kent State University tried to submerge the memory of that event. And, you know, they tried to build a sports annex there, and they did other things to discourage the memory. And when they originally funded the May 4th commemoration every year, and then after 5 years they stopped, and expecting that then it would go away. But in fact, a group of students and alumni and survivors rose up and raised money and established the May 4th Commemoration Commission, a task force, and it has grown in popularity and in attendance and participation year after year after year, and finally, after several attempts, this group was able to get the U.S. government to declare it a national historical monument, the shooting site. And there are now a number of markers on the campus where the dead students fell and other things, so that clearly the momentum that honors the value of history and remembrance is so important, and it will continue on and on and on, I hope, because the people who are not only honoring the students who died and were wounded, but they're also providing a public statement that justice was never done. No one was ever held accountable for these murders. And so that is, you know, thinking about the role of our government and the role of the law enforcement and, in this case, National Guardsmen, to protect our students, our people, our citizens, rather than shooting them or tear gassing them or whatever. These are important lessons that should be carried forward. And that's why one of the reasons I wrote that book finally, and hope that over time, lessons of the terrible things that happened, the mistakes that were made by people in charge, will not be forgotten.
I think that's a great answer. I'm just curious. I would like to know, Mr. Giles, have you visited the May 4th Visitor Center that opened in 2014?
I have, yes.
Okay. I was just curious about that.
Yes, I've been there a couple of times.
Okay. I was just curious because, you know, as someone who wasn't alive during the event, but I was a museum studies student, and we did a project with them as they were building the center. It's a very visceral experience that, you know, I think it's a good showing of why we remember what happened that day. So that's why I want to say that.
And there are, from time to time, they'll put up special exhibits for one of the victims. There was one recently in honor of, in remembrance of Sandy Schroyer. A lot of pictures. I think her family helped organize that, but it's a very touching memory of that young lady.
Right. So we have two questions. I'm going to combine them for clarity. And it goes back to why. Why did they shoot, and why was lethal force used? You know, it's open-ended, but why? What was the real reason that you believe?
Well, nobody knows the real reason why they shot, except that what they claim, which was they feared that their lives were in danger. But if you think about the circumstances that was evolving in that moment, the National Guard was carrying out its mission: don't allow the students to have a rally. And in doing so, they pushed the students up the Commons. If you're familiar with the Kent State campus, it's a hill that goes past the Victory Bell and then up over a knoll and then down Blanket Hill. And the guardsmen, the students were parting as the guardsmen came through, because a lot of students thought, well, these guys have their steel helmets on, their gas masks, their M1 rifles. They mean business. So the students were giving them some space. And then the guardsmen found themselves sort of trapped against a fence at a football field, practice field. And they were confused. And there's a famous photograph of a single student with a flag, black flag, standing in front of the guard, waving it. That student was Alan Canforo, who passed away recently. But it was a courageous moment. And then the guardsmen reassembled and started to march back up the hill. And people thought, well, they must feel that they've done their job. They're going back to their headquarters. And they got to the top of the hill where the pagoda is, and without any visible signal, hand signal, voice signal, whatever, 28 of them turned and fired at the students. Now, there's never been a clear explanation of why they did that, except their attempt to excuse their behavior because they said there was a sniper or that their lives were in danger. So the quest for the truth of why, if anybody gave an order to shoot and why they would do that, remains a mystery. And that's one of the sort of enticing elements of this story that will keep it alive in many of our minds going forward, because it's a question that we simply haven't been able to answer. My book doesn't answer it, certainly. None of the other books that have been written will answer that question either. But the pursuit of that may go to the grave with a lot of the people who participated.
And they have never broken their silence.
No. No, there are several years later there was published a list of those who shot their weapons, 28 soldiers, but they had names and ranks and so on, but they were never able to connect the individual soldier and his rifle, his M1 rifle, with individual spent bullets found around the campus. Soon after the shooting, the National Guard leadership collected all the M1 rifles that had been shot, because they intended to try to match. And an M1 rifle is inside the barrel. There's a rifling marking, and so it puts a stamp, an identification stamp, on every bullet that's been fired. And so they were hoping that from the bodies of the dead and the wounded and other places around the campus, they could recapture, relocate the bullets, the spent bullets, and match them up with the rifling in the M1 rifles, and be able to tell who fired the fatal shots, who fired the wounding shots. Well, that exercise never bore fruit, because the weapon, the bullets, were in bad shape. Those who went into bodies tended to explode. those who hit cars, who hit other things, were destroyed as well. So they were never able to make a sufficient match, a match at all, that would have told us this soldier fired that bullet into that person. And it's a tragedy because, as failed as the leadership was by the National Guard commanders, this was an honest effort to establish the identity of those who fired the fatal bullets. When you think of 28 soldiers standing in a small group firing at students, and they fired over a long period, a long distance. I mean, two of the dead students were at least 300 feet away, and they were on their way to class. They weren't even participating in the demonstration. But so it's just hard to imagine why they shot. There's no evidence that there was any command given. In fact, the picture on the cover of our book, it shows the shooting moment, and way in the back of the picture is a man in a business suit with a gas mask on the top of his head. That's Brigadier General Robert Canterbury. He was the commander of the troops. Now, he wasn't leading them; he was following them. And one of the questions I had was why he was never court-martialed for failure of leadership. And what I learned was that under the Code of Military Justice, if the National Guard unit had been assigned to Kent State by President Nixon, they would have fallen under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and they would have been subject to court-martial. But because they were assigned by the governor of Ohio, James Rhodes, they fell under the laws of the state of Ohio. And courts-martial is not part of that legal system. So there were a number of lawsuits and grand jury investigations and hearings and so on. Came to nothing. And then finally, the legal pursuit of justice finally ended 9 years later, 1979, when the state of Ohio agreed to a settlement, $675,000. It's a pittance when you think of the settlements in today's courts, but that money was divided among the victims, and most of the money went to a victim named Dean Taylor, who was shot in the spine and who can't walk. And so he got most of the $675,000. The rest of it was divided among the families of the victims.
I would like to thank both of you, Bob and Doug. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for sharing your story and your experience working behind the scenes at the Akron Beacon Journal. Like I said, I think this was a really interesting perspective and one we really don't hear much. And so I'd like to thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that you were able to be together in the same space.
We are too.
And I'd like to thank everyone who attended this program this evening. Thank you so much. Remember, the book, When Truth Mattered, is available for purchase. The Hudson's Bookstore, The Learned Owl, does have copies available for purchase, or you can even borrow it from your local library. Thank
Kelsey,
you so much. Yes, go ahead.
I want to say, I read the book early. It truly is a page turner. I know that's hard to say about a book about an event we know, but you won't be disappointed, because if you're a fan of like TikTok newsroom capers, you really see Bob and his staff chasing this story down, trying to figure it out on the fly. And I I review a lot of books, but I really forgot like how this was going to end. And it's a testament to Bob's clarity of writing here. And plus, just we owe an accurate picture of this global event to the reporting of that newspaper of that day. And so it's he's a very humble guy, but
Thank you.
it's a really good read. It really is.
Well, thank you so much for the glowing review, Doug. I'm sure I have read portions of the book, and I can agree. It's very thorough. It's very detailed. It shows that you have the facts. And I'd like to thank you both for that. And thank you for your time this evening. Okay.
Thank you.
Again, thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good evening.